All right. Welcome, everyone. We really appreciate you coming out today to listen to our discussion on Hadoop security at Comcast. The last day of the summit, the last slot before lunchtime, really fantastic day outside with security. There are a lot of sexy talks at this summit. Security is a critical piece of our application infrastructures, and we thought it was really important to talk about our own journey in setting up security. I mean, the technical side of Hadoop security is pretty straightforward in its way, but the journey to get there is a significant one if you've been through it. And if, like many of you, you set up your Hadoop environment and then kind of backed into Kerberizing your cluster, and then we share that same story. My name is Ray Harrison. I am a principal architect at Comcast. I'm with my colleague Dushyant Thvadi, also a principal architect at Comcast on our enterprise Hadoop platform. We're going to talk about that security journey. We're going to talk about what the challenges are in a multi-tenant environment. So by multi-tenant, we mean full stack with 1,000+ users, every kind of use case you can imagine, from analytics to real-time ingest to really crazy data science stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about our security framework, design, and guidelines, and a little bit about our next steps. But really, it's about it's about relationship building when you implement security, because it is a massive undertaking across a lot of organizations. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So Comcast, we're obviously a technology and media and entertainment company. We have multiple lines of business that we need to secure from a Hadoop standpoint, for sure. We have roughly 24 million customers across those lines of business and have done a little bit of revenue over the years. Just a hair. And we have here our Comcast Center in Philadelphia. Now, Dushyant and I are actually from the Colorado office, and we think that might work out a little bit better, from our perspective, but to each his own. So, big data use cases from the point of view of the cable industry. We obviously have our set-top boxes, where we can collect interesting information. Our cable modems provide a lot of insight into sort of the health of the signal going into your house, as an example. And then that can get aggregated up to neighborhoods and then to municipalities. A very interesting use case. And then everything that kind of sits behind those cable modems as well, so sits on your Wi-Fi network. A lot of very, very interesting use cases around your phones and tablets and home automation as part of one of our lines of business. A little bit about our environment. We are Hortonworks customer, and we're on 2.4 something at this point, looking later this year to migrate to 2.6. Again, if you have a large ecosystem, doing upgrades is a very difficult task, or at least you need to be very, very careful with it. We partner with a company called Pepperdata. They help us manage our capacity and to do analytics and analysis on our nodes, and so we use them a lot. To make the most out of the applications that run, we also use Dr. Elephant a lot. And I point that out because one of the things that's true about Comcast is that we're very much focused on open source initiatives, and we've begun the process to commit the TES component of Dr. Elephant. So we look forward to getting that out over actually the next couple of weeks. Last year at the summit, we demoed a tool called Command Center. Again, to support open source initiatives, we're going to be deploying this as an open source project, and it really helps us manage SLAs across multiple clusters. So we have sort of a core data lake, we have a core data science data lake, and then we also have multiple satellite clusters to help us manage SLA-bound jobs and processes to help them run in isolation. And Command Center helps us manage and look at those tools. We run in our core data lake about 50,000 jobs a day, again, across analytics, batch, real-time, crazy data science stuff. We're in the tens of petabytes, high tens of petabytes. Again, the full stack, so we do run not just Hive and some of the standard components of Hadoop, but we're heavy Accumulo users, we're heavy Spark users and Storm users, and you name it, we use it. A lot of data science tools like AtScale, a lot of the common ones like R and the like. And data science folks are, if you work with them, they love anything new, and so we try to accommodate anything new, which is exciting as well. Evolution of Hadoop in the enterprise, again, you've probably all been there. It's first, a science fair project. You start identifying data sets that you want to bring in and start answering pretty unique questions about that. It becomes the Wild West after that because people start hearing about your ecosystem and they go, hey, I want to come in. I want to be able to answer all these interesting questions about my data set. And you start to notice, well, it's a little bit difficult to manage, and so you decide, well, let's put in some governance around that. And pretty soon, you start to have a stable ecosystem. You start to go, hey, I can do this Hadoop stuff in the enterprise. Next step, you have really your first security audit, and after that, you get this document that's a mile thick, right? And they point out all of these things that you're not so good at and that you need to start bringing a tighter security realm into your ecosystem. Hadoop out of the box brings certain security, certainly at the file system level, and you use ACLs and whatnot, but next step for everybody really is introducing Kerberos into the ecosystem, and then that's really kind of where our story starts today, and how we end up doing that. Why do we want to do that? Well, you've all seen this number. It's an average number that I think IBM and Crew came up with in 2016 to talk about what the true cost of data breaches are. I think in the United States it's more like 7 million. So that, again, there's this average here, and when you start looking at big data ecosystems, the idea that you could lose petabytes of data really, it keeps me awake at night anyway. There are a lot of security challenges with Hadoop, not the least of which that security is really a relatively recent focus with Hadoop. I mean, it's kind of been there. There have been third-party vendor add-ons, and there's, you could always do Kerberos, things like that, but it's really only recently that it's started to be a main focus and to be a little bit more mature than it has in the past. It's a very complex solution when you try and do Kerberos with the large ecosystem that you might have. Staff experience levels. So traditional relational database, and Dushyant here will talk about a little bit more about that. You can find a person that can secure an Oracle rack under every rock, practically, but it's very difficult to find really good staff to do that work, and so there's a lot of training that needs to take place. Existing corporate security policies. So every company has a lot of security policies. Security teams aren't always, as up on Hadoop ecosystems that you would like them to be. And so with all of this in mind, we're going to sort of take you on our security journey. And I'm going to turn it over now to Dushyant to take us through it.
Thanks, Ray. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure everybody has done some kind of security, either on the existing RDBMS that you might have, or a bit on like the Hadoop clusters or like the little POC clusters that you might have. So the security on the RDBMS has been there for around 40, 50 years now, and everybody is like well versed with it. Everybody understands on how security works. But when it comes to the Hadoop security, there are like multiple components. We have Kerberos, we have like Ranger, we have Knox, the data encryption at rest. So it's multiple moving parts and multiple layers of security that you can implement on the Hadoop. And we do have like a number of third-party applications, some of which still does not support like connecting to a Kerberos cluster. So there's like still a long way to go. In our environment, we do have multiple production clusters spread across multiple data centers. And that did add complexity to the overall project. So our security journey was like close to a year, right from the start to the implementation. It involves like talking with multiple people, multiple teams, and a continuous communication with multiple teams. So I'll walk you through the kickstarting the project and like the research that we have done and like some of the challenges that we faced while implementing the security. So to kickstart the things, you need to start talking with your corporate security team, the Linux team, the development team, the business on like why and what Hadoop security is. And in many ways, and it's common among multiple teams to think like Hadoop security is similar to an RDBMS security. In our environment, we have seen like the corporate security team and the Linux team just like saying like, oh, okay, it's like security we have done and dealt with it before. But once you start communicating like the internal details of like how Kerberos works within Hadoop, it's not like what Kerberos is, but it's like how Kerberos works on Hadoop and how it changes the way on how a cluster is accessed and like all the internals. It's a good idea to have like a one-on-one session with like all the teams to give an overview of like why we are implementing it and like the timelines that it would be implemented. And there are like multiple pieces again, like Kerberos, Ranger, and like Knox. Kerberos is like going to be the basis for implementing the rest of the components. So, and the corporate security team, that is where you are going to get like a big push back from. There are like existing corporate policies which may not fit well with the security policies that you want to implement on your Hadoop cluster. So right on like day one, when you think of security and you want to implement it on your Hadoop cluster, you want to talk with the corporate security team and make sure that like they do understand what we are doing and how it's going to be implemented. So once you start off the project, the next thing is to go into the technical details. You need to closely work with the Linux team, the network team, the security team, the corporate security team on like the internal details of like what security framework that you are going to implement, how it is going to be implemented, and what is going to change. One of the things that we have done was to have like a technical deep dive with the Linux team, because it's common for them to say like, okay, the security Kerberos, like we know that it works on our Linux servers. But implementing the Kerberos security on a Hadoop cluster is going to be different. You'll have to be going to change your, probably your KRB5 cons, the key stores, and multiple other files. So do have like a deep dive discussions with all the Linux teams and like the security team, and if you have an open LDAP team or like an Active Directory team, you do need to have like discussions with them before you finalize a security solution or like a security framework which would be implemented. So with any project comes like the costs. Either like you need to train the people, you need to have like to bring additional resources onto the team for the implementation, add more contractors, provide more hours to the developers. You need to identify like the costs that come along with the whole project. And when it's going to be like on a huge cluster that's going to span on like for multiple months, there's like some cost added to that. So it's not easy to say like, okay, I do have like enough people and I can assign them tasks and like do the agile methodology, but you still end up having some additional hours that need to be added. So the security framework, this is going to be the most important piece that you'll be picking up. In our environment, we have done multiple POCs. We have done like an open LDAP plus Active Directory, and like a dedicated KDC server plus an open LDAP and like multiple other combinations. We did spend a good amount of like 3 to 4 months doing like the multiple POCs, working back with the Linux teams, the Active Directory team, before we finalized the solution. One of the challenges we had in our environment was we did have like multiple realms. So, and it's common in like some of the bigger corporations to have multiple realms. It's going to be a huge challenge if you have like multiple realms and you're going to set up like a one-way trust or like a two-way trust. You'll be adding like a lot of configuration changes and like multiple workarounds to have that work on the Hadoop cluster. So after doing multiple POCs and working with multiple teams and doing like all the scenarios, so when you pick up like a solution, you need to think of like all the knowns and like the unknowns, like how the user is going to interact with that cluster, how the third-party applications are going to interact with the cluster, what are the things that are going to change. So in our environment, as like we did not have like a single sign-on to the Hadoop cluster servers. But we ended up picking up a solution which would provide like the single sign-on. So we used the enterprise Active Directory for the authentication, and we used the open LDAP for the authorization. And that did resolve like a lot of hurdles when we later on implemented it and doing the integrations with the third-party tools. And also you need to also think of like the connections that are coming in from the external sources, like past the Hadoop cluster and past your enterprises. Probably you're getting data from like third-party vendors or like from other data streaming sets. So you need to even think of that on like how they're going to interact with the Kerberos cluster. You're going to have like data pushed or data coming from the cloud. So you need to test those scenarios on like what changes have to be done and like what's the best security framework that you need to pick that covers all these scenarios. So some of the guidelines that we have come up for like picking up a security framework. As you're like doing multiple POCs and like talking with multiple teams, probably you're constrained by the amount of time that you have or like the resources that you have. You might end up like just picking up the easiest solution. Somebody says the Linux team or like the AD team says just do this and it will be all done. But you have to do your homework on testing out like all the scenarios, making sure like the user interaction, like the applications, the code, what's the impact of it, and see if it's like feasible and supportable in the long run. So the solution that you pick, for example, like in our environment, we picked a solution, and it did require the support of the Active Directory team, the Open LDAP team, and the Linux team. Since our environment is like a 24/7, we do have a DEVOPS model of 24/7. So when an issue comes up with like an Active Directory or like an Open LDAP, we need to make sure like the Open LDAP team does also have the 24/7 support model. And like if it's not there, then probably that may not be our best solution. So you need to pick a solution that's like feasible, but it's not the easiest. And as I said earlier, if you do have like multiple realms, and if it's possible, do pick up the single sign-on solution so that it's much easier for the users, and like when you're integrating the third-party applications and like integrating the cloud services, Amazon or like Azure. And one of the reasons is if you have like the multiple realms, you are going to end up like doing the one-way trusts and the two-way trusts. You need to open up firewalls, you need to get like security approvals, and that's going to take quite a long time. So, and once you start implementing security, you're going to gather a lot of passwords. You're going to have like the service accounts, the application accounts, the Java key stores, and multiple other things. Given like the full stack of components we use and like the number of users that we have, we ended up with like hundreds of passwords. So the DevOps team need to have like a good reliable password management tool. And if not, like they just end up like in your notepads or like sticky notes, and like somebody forgets their password and then you recreate the password, you'll have to redistribute the key tabs and the Java key stores like across all the cluster. It's going to be a lot of hours and a lot of troubleshooting to figure that out. So the password management tool is also like an important thing for the DevOps team. So the plan for the DevOps team. The first thing to do is like provide training to the DevOps team. In our environment, we did have like a formal training from Hortonworks on the Kerberos architecture and how it works on the Hadoop. Past that, we did have multiple internal follow-up trainings to make sure the DevOps team understands like how the Active Directory works, what are the roles, the groups, the organization, and how a key tab works, what are the encryption types, and all the details. And it's important that you do put that effort in training the DevOps team. Probably it took us like 3 months to bring them up to speed on all this. And it does help in a long way during the implementation and also like troubleshooting. And because like the DevOps team does not understand the internal workings of like how the OpenLDAP works, what is a realm, what is the configuration file, and how each of the parameters in a configuration file work, it's going to be tough for them to troubleshoot issues later on once you start implementation. And like the support. So with the DevOps team, with any project, there are going to be like hundreds of tickets. One of the things that we have seen in our environment was like our support is spread across the globe. So if like any of the issue is raised and it's solved, it needs to be documented. You're going to have like hundreds of tickets for like as simple as like the K-init has not been done, a K-list has not been done for checking up the ticket, and probably like the realm configuration has not been done right. So when you have like a support model across the globe, you need to make sure like you're documenting each and every change that has been done. You're going to do like a lot of changes for the code, a lot of configurations for the third-party application tools, and multiple other configurations for like the data that's coming in from the cloud or like from the external sources. So documentation is going to be like a huge, huge thing as you start from the lower environments right up to the production and for support as you move on. So the user community plan, so the developers in general, so it has like the 4 steps of analyzing, coordination, communicating, and the final delivery. So they analyze. The developers need to document and analyze all the jobs that are running on the cluster, all the codes that's on the cluster, to make sure like all the changes are done. And in practice, 99% of the time, all the code, all the jobs that are running on the cluster has to be changed. We do in our environment have seen like wherein like the developer did not know like because the job has been running for like 3 years, 4 years now, and he said like probably the changes are not required. And that would not be the case. Every single job that's out there on the cluster needs to be accounted for, it has to be documented, and the changes being made. And as simple as like an SFTP would fail. If you're getting like data from like an external source, you need to make sure like the SFTP commands and like the configurations have those Kerberos tickets or like the Kerberos code in there. So it's important that everything is documented because like you might have jobs, as like Ray said, we do have like around like 50,000 jobs. So it did take like a lot of time for us to track down like all the jobs, who is owning it and who is managing it, who are the development teams. Because like whoever has like written the job and implemented it like 4 years ago probably is no longer with the company. So everything has to be like tracked down and tested. Coordination. This is going to be one of the big important pieces. So the DevOps team from their end, they're going to come up with like the plan on like when it has to be implemented, all the changes that has to be done at the cluster level and the configurations. But also the developers need to make sure that they're working with the DevOps team constantly to see like what are the code changes that has to be done. The developers need to do their homework to understand Kerberos. In our scenario, we have seen like they do not spend enough time to understand how Kerberos works on the cluster. So the DevOps team need to constantly educate the developers on like, okay, you need to make these code changes, you need to test this is how you do. And this is going to take the developers a long time to do it. The developers sometimes just like kind of think like I did this, make single change. For example, you have like a workflow of like 10 jobs. The developers change the code in just one of the jobs of the 10. And the whole workflow is going to fail because they did not analyze and see like what other changes have to be done. So this is like something that they have to work with the DevOps team to make sure like everything is in place. So with the implementation of security, there are going to be the changes in process and procedures that you might already have in place, either like you're ingesting data or you're retrieving data. This is something that you need to communicate to the business on what are the changes that comes along with implementation of the security. You need to have like properly documented procedures in case you do not have already. So what is the approval process? Once you implement like the ranger for the data authorization policies, you need to have the procedures in place on like what is the approval process of who can view the data, who cannot, and who can actually approve, who can see the data. And it's going to take like a few months. It's not like going to happen like over a month or like 2 months. Given like the size of your data sets and the organization and how it's spread out, it is going to take a few months to coordinate and communicate with the business and the data owners on like what the security implications are and what are the things that has to be changed. And in our environment, as I said, the whole project was like close to an year. And some of the things can be done in like parallel. So you start talking with the corporate security team on the security framework that you want to implement. You can start talking with the data owners and the business owners on like we are going to implement security and like these are the changes that are coming in. You can start training your developers and the DevOps teams. So you need to plan on like what are the tasks that can be done in parallel and what has to be done first. So that helps managing the time and the project timelines overall. And the delivery. So the developers have like made all the code changes, they have tested it, and they said like, okay, it's good to go, and like they did deploy it in production. And that's going to fail. And we did see in our environment wherein, because like the Kerberos has not been enabled in the production yet, the developers think since like the code changes are made, they can be deployed and they're good to go. And the code is going to fail. So this is like something once again that you need to work with the DevOps team and like the architects for like doing the deployment on like the actual day when the Kerberos is enabled on the cluster. You cannot do it like way before or like sometime like a week after the Kerberos is implemented. Challenges. So every project is going to have its own challenges. It can be like the business challenges, technical challenges, or like financials, or like anything. So if you talk about the business challenges, the business is not really interested in like what Hadoop security is, what are the technical details, what it does, as long as the business deliverables are on time. But it's important the architects and the development managers do communicate with the business on what are the changes that are going to come with the implementation of the security. It's going to be a complete change from an unsecured cluster to a secured cluster. Probably when you did not have security, when you did not have like the ranger policies, everybody can come in, everybody can access anything, and they can do anything. But once you do the ranger, you do have like the data policies, and you're like auditing all the things that are being done. You need to have like your approvals and the procedures in place. And it's going to take a few months for the business to get their head around this on like why do we need to make the change. Because they consider the OLTP systems, the regular RDBMS like Oracle and SQL Server, since they are our transactional systems, that is where like security is required, and like Hadoop is like wide open, you do not require security. But with all the traditional BI tools that we do have like right now, and we also do use like the reporting from the data that's coming out of Hadoop. So you need to make sure the business understands that and say like security is as important as on the Hadoop, similar to the RDBMS. So some of the challenges with the development teams. So the developers are like swapped with multiple priorities, multiple projects, and like testing out new tools and new versions. We did see in our environment wherein like the developers would not put in enough time to understand what Kerberos is and like what are the changes that has to be done, or they would not test it like completely. They would just put in a couple of lines of code, test that a little piece of unit, and say like everything is good to go. So that cannot be done. So as I said, like if your workflow has got like 10 jobs, each and every job has to be analyzed and make sure like the code changes are being made. One of the things that we did face was the developers not having the knowledge on how to debug the issues. For example, like they do get the GSS exception. They open up a ticket to the DevOps team and say like, it's not working, it's on you right now. The simple thing is like they do not do the K-init. So you need to provide like the training to the developers along with the DevOps team on like how the Kerberos architecture works and what are the code changes that has to be done at a high level. You need to make like the code changes for like the Storm, Accumulo, Kafka, as I said, like every piece and every component of the cluster. So training the developers does help the developers and also the DevOps teams to deal with like a lot of issues. We started off like getting in our environment like hundreds of tickets just for like GSS exceptions or like a key tab files. We did have like people wherein they would have just done like a simple Google search and they would have known like what was the issue. But like as I said, like the developers are swapped with like multiple projects. They get an error, they don't go through the details, they open up a ticket. So if you do spend time educating your developers on how the Kerberos works and at a high level on like what are the issues that they might come up, it would be much easier. We did spin up like a wiki page with all the troubleshooting and like all the common issues that the developers would get or any issues that we do get with the Kerberos. And that has helped us a lot. So some of the challenges with the DevOps team. So in our environment, we did have like the DevOps models spread across the globe. And most of the time, it's like very hard for the offshore team to bring them up to speed on what's going on here. It did take us like multiple training sessions and a good amount of like 3 to 4 months to bring the DevOps team, like the offshore team, up to speed on like what Kerberos implementation we are doing and like what's going on with like the multiple realms and what are all the changes that are happening. And it's once again back to like educating the DevOps team to bring them up to speed, because if the offshore does not understand what's going on, it's once again the tickets going back and forth between the onshore, offshore, and the development team. So it's just like the email chain will be going in like circles. In our environment, so we did have like a number of third-party applications like Tableau, like Presto, and like the data science tools, Informatica, you name it, and most probably we have it. So these applications run both on the Windows and like Mac machines, and each of the applications has got like multiple versions. For example, you might have like a 10.3 in like the production, like a 10.2 in stage, and like something else in development environment. So the DevOps team need to spend enough time configuring and making all the changes and documenting each and every configuration change that is required for each of the application. And it does take like 4 to 6 months. It's not going to be an easy task. For like an RDBMS, probably like the documentation is out there, and like all the BI tools, all the applications does support it, because the security for an RDBMS has been there for like 40, 50 years now. But the documentation is not good enough, or like is not in place yet for some of the tools out. So the DevOps team is going to spend a good amount of time trying to troubleshoot it, trying to document it on what are the changes and how they should be made. And you need to sometimes work with the vendors like Informatica or Tableau. You'll be working with the vendors over like multiple hours trying to figure out on how some of the things has to be fixed. We did see like scenarios wherein like the vendor would update their own documentation because they did not have it in right. So it's going to take quite a while for having all the third-party applications work with the security cluster. And as I said earlier, some of the tasks can be done in parallel to make sure the project is in like the timeline is in good. Like the training, the configurations, working with the Linux teams and the security teams, all these things can be done in parallel. So once you're done with like the Kerberos, which is going to be the basis, is like the Ranger. So you're going to build like the data authorization policies. This is back to working with the data owners. More than like the technical part of it, it is working with the data owners and the business on how you define the policies, what Ranger can and cannot do. It's easy to have like 100 policies on like day one, and that's not going to help, because it's important to understand like how a policy works, how it affects the data retrieval and like the access. So you start off like doing like a high level basic policy for like the data sets, and then you refine the policies as you go. And like this one takes like a few months, because you need to have like a one-on-one session with the data owners and the business to make them understand what like Ranger is and what it cannot and cannot do, and you start working with there. So once you are done with like the Ranger is the encryption. So there are like multiple ways of like the data encryption that you can do. In our environment, we are going to implement the HDFS data at rest encryption. And you do not want to encrypt all the petabytes of data that you have there. You want to identify only like the data sets which are highly sensitive. You need to talk with the governance team and like the business to identify those particular data sets. You do not want to say like, okay, this data set has got like a social security number, I'm going to encrypt all the terabyte of data. You can encrypt just only a set of the whole data set. And this is once again because like once you do add encryption to the cluster, it takes up resources, it takes up memory, and it takes up CPU. So you don't want to encrypt all the data that's out there, like or all the complete data sets that you have on the cluster. And then this one is once again working with the data owners. When you're working with like on the policies, this is something that you can also cover is like, okay, what are the sensitive data sets within the whole data and which has to be encrypted. So to summarize on like what I have covered till now is communication is going to be a huge thing. We did have like multiple communications going on over a period of time, as I said, like over a whole year, multiple emails, Slack channels, posting on the websites, and multiple meetings, war rooms, until we do have like people coming like the day before saying that like, oh, we did not know this was coming. So do over communicate, and it does not hurt. It's going to help you. Picking up the security framework, as I said, like if you have like multiple realms or multiple Active Directories and open LDAPs, you need to do like good amount of work to pick up like the right solution, testing out like all the scenarios that you can think of, data that's coming in from the cloud, data that's coming from the external resources, the third-party integration tools, and how the user is going to interact with the cluster. And the last is the coordination between the DevOps teams and the developers. it's going to take a long time to get all the code working. Once you implement Kerberos, it's not just like you make these couple of code changes that you see in like the HOTOMX documentation or like some documentation. You are going to do a lot more than that. You might have like custom frameworks for data ingestions. You might have like frameworks for like reading out data or like data that's been pulled out of the reports. So that's like something that you need to work closely with the DevOps team to make like whatever the code changes that are being done is like supported and is like feasible. That's it. Thanks for your time. If anybody has any questions, please. Sure.
You mentioned that you are using AD for the authentication and you're using the OpenLDAP for the authorization. How do you sync up those? Are you sync up regularly for all those user accounts over?
So in our realm, we do have like the user authentication. So we have like multiple realms in our environment. So the user authentication piece, so we use like the SSSD module on the CentOS 6.8.
Yeah, I got this part. So my question is, for example, okay, I'm using my AD for the authentication. Right? I mean, I put in my password. Then
Sure.
then I access my HADOOP environment, but this user needs to be in the HADOOP OpenLDAP, as you mentioned, for the OpenLDAP for all those authentications. But do you, I mean, often sync all the users to the OpenLDAP from the
Oh yeah, that's right. Behind the scenes, like the users are being synced from like the Active Directory to the OpenLDAP.
So you are syncing every single user or selective users. For example,
Yeah.
I only sync, say, engineers. Those kind of. Are you doing that or?
Every user that accesses like a Linux server, not just Hadoop, but like all the Linux servers in our environment are managed through the OpenLDAP. So everybody, anybody who is using the Linux is being synced.